Hi, I'm Lindsay Bugby from the Postman's Knock, and today we are going to talk about how and why to use Sumi ink for your calligraphy. Traditionally, Sumi inks are made from burnt bones, a binder, and water. Now, in the case of Yasutomo Sumi ink, this is a completely vegan Sumi ink, so no animals were harmed in order to make this ink, which is obviously always a good thing. It's also a non-toxic ink, so would I recommend going out and drinking a bottle of it? Yeah, no, but if you get some in your mouth, if you get some on your skin, you don't have to worry about it because there aren't toxic chemicals in this ink. What I love the most about Sumi ink is the way that it dries. So once you get your Sumi ink down on the page and all of the water has evaporated out, you're left with this beautiful matte texture, and it has a great jet black color. So I find when I use India inks, the sheen is a little bit too shiny for me. This Sumi ink, and it's not just Yasutomo inks, just Sumi inks in general, tend to give you this really great matte look. All right, so let's talk about how to use this ink. I store my Sumi ink in a 1 ounce glass jar, and when it starts to get a little low, then I keep enough Sumi ink around that I can just top it off. And then what you'll want to do is see whether the Sumi ink texture is a good fit for the nib that you're using. So I am using a Browse Extra Fine 66 nib. The Extra Fine 66 tends to prefer thinner inks, so a lot of times you'll have to dilute the Sumi ink with some water, but let's see. So you dip it and dip your nib in the ink. And then let's see how this goes here. Very nice. Usually when you get that ink fresh out of the container, it is the perfect consistency. Not always, but usually. All right, so this is working really well. I had actually hoped that I might run into some trouble so I could demo for you, but let's make some trouble for ourselves. So a lot of times people run into the issue that Sumi ink doesn't descend from the nib. And so a lot of beginners, sorry, I'm just looking for my cleaning cloth. A lot of beginners assume that something is wrong with the nib, but in reality, it's actually the ink that there's something wrong with. So before you do anything with your nib, always dilute your ink with water. If you can, you want to use distilled water because it doesn't have any minerals in it, but I usually just use tap water and I haven't run into any issues. It just depends on where you are. And by that, I mean the water quality where you live, you know, what the city or the county decides to add to your water. Is that going to eventually encourage mold growth in your ink, for example? So always a safe bet to use distilled, but you don't have to. Either way, distilled or tap, you'll want to fill a blunt art syringe with 0.5 milliliters of water and go ahead and squirt that into your ink. And then you can stir it in with the blunt end of a paintbrush or a chopstick or whatever. And then go ahead and try to write again. And you can see that even though my ink didn't need to be diluted, it's still writing quite well. So it's difficult to add too much water to this ink. But if you do, you'll know that's the case because the ink has sort of a transparent look to it. And if that happens, you can either add more Sumi ink into your jar, or you can let the jar sit out overnight with the lid off so some of that water can evaporate out. I recommend Sumi Ink to calligraphy beginners for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that whatever you're doing is always really visible because this ink is so dark and nice. So for example, if you want to make a few flourishes, you can very vividly see those upstrokes. So as a beginner, that's really nice to have that instant feedback. Okay. Now just for comparison's sake, let me show you what these flourishes look like with iron gall ink. So iron gall, I would call it a more intermediate ink because it's much thinner than Sumi. And when you go up with the upstrokes here, do you see how you can barely make those out? So the iron gall ink is absolutely fabulous, don't get me wrong, but sometimes it can really throw beginners because you can't see those upstrokes as you're making them. So that's why it's nice to have Sumi Ink to use. I also really like that Sumi Ink encourages beginners to play around with consistency. So like I just showed you, if the nib is acting up a little bit, your ink isn't descending onto the page, you can always add water to the ink and mix it in. And I really like that aspect of the ink because it makes beginners not be afraid to fiddle a little bit with their ink consistencies, which comes in really handy when you decide that you want to, write with gouache, with watercolors, with other inks, because you can also dilute India inks. As far as how much Sumi ink to buy, I would start off with a 2-ounce container if I were a beginner, just because you want to make sure that you actually like the ink, you like the texture, you like using the ink. If you do, then you can move on to a 6-ounce container. I've got a 12-ounce right here, but that's just because I use a lot of Sumi ink, and this has lasted me about 4 or 5 years. So once you have the ink, it takes a very long time to go bad. It's really not a bad idea to have a larger size. I really like the 6 and 12-ounce Yasutomos because they come with this dispenser here. So you just unscrew it and then you pour the ink into the container. And the nice thing about this design is the ink doesn't get all over the place, which is really important because Sumi ink is difficult to get out of clothes and carpets and anything else it might get on that's a porous surface. So again, start off with the 2-ounce. If you like that, then it would be a good idea to invest in a larger size. Another reason to love Sumi ink is how scannable it is. So if you use an ink like iron gall here, iron gall looks amazing in real life. So it's great for envelopes. But if you're doing something on the computer where you need to scan it in and you need to make sure that you're seeing all of the upstrokes and also that you have a lot of consistency as far as the color goes, you don't have a lot of gradation, then Sumi ink is your best bet because it doesn't have that shininess to it that India ink has. Since it dries matte, it doesn't really reflect light off of the scanner, so it scans super well. So next time you're thinking, okay, you want to make, a wedding invitation, it is a good idea to make your design with Sumi ink and then scan it into the computer and work with your graphics on Photoshop or Illustrator from there. The only real gripe I have with Sumi ink is how quickly its viscosity changes. So a lot of times if you are practicing, you'll be sitting here with your ink for an hour or two, and that entire time you're sitting there, water is slowly evaporating out of the ink. And here in a place like Colorado where it's really dry, that water tends to evaporate out quickly, but you don't realize it. So you might have one writing session that's really great with Sumi ink, and then you come back a couple of days later to create more calligraphy, and all of a sudden, when you go to make an upstroke, the stroke is skipping, so it looks kind of like this, or the ink is not descending from the nib any longer, so you are pushing down, but nothing is happening. And in that case, It is because water has evaporated out of the ink. So 9 times out of 10, if you are having a problem using this ink, the problem is the viscosity, and you just need to add some water in, just like I showed you. Don't blame the nib to start off with. Blame the ink. Add water. It never hurts to add water to your ink, and then try and see if that helps. As far as what nibs to use with Sumi Ink, it's a pretty equal opportunity ink when it comes to that. So you could use a more rigid nib like the Nico G. See, no problems there. But it works equally well with a more flexible nib like the Browse Extra Fine 66. The only thing is, with the Extra Fine 66, you'll find yourself needing to redip that nib in ink more often, no matter what ink you're using, just because it is such a small nib. But really, you can use Sumi Ink with just about any nib. It doesn't really favor one nib over the other. And if you are having troubles with your ink, again, dilute it with water and then try. As far as other things to note, one thing that I'd like you to know is the Sumi Ink is not waterproof. So it is water resistant, which means that if you use this ink to calligraph an envelope, for example, and there's a rainstorm, some raindrops get on the envelope, all is not lost. It might smudge a little bit if it's rubbed against something, but it's not going to be completely unreadable. So let's just take a look at what that looks like. See, you can still see the ink underneath this water, but it's certainly running, right? So this is not a completely waterproof ink. A lot of inks aren't completely waterproof. If you do want to use a black ink that's 110% waterproof, always Ziller is going to be your best option. But I wouldn't worry too much about Sumi Ink running on envelopes out in the world. You know what I mean? It's not super, it's not going to be ruined by water, but it's not waterproof. So do not use Sumi Ink in conjunction with watercolors. I hope that today's video introduces you to a new beloved supply, which is Sumi Ink. Or if you already have Sumi Ink, I hope that the video helps you to troubleshoot it. Really, the most important thing to remember is dilute, dilute, dilute. Don't be afraid to add water and stir it in there, because that's almost always going to help as far as your calligraphy creation goes. Just, don't be scared to mess with the viscosity a little bit. The Sumi Ink is the ink that we use in the Beginner's Modern Calligraphy online course. So if you are taking that course, be sure to get some of this ink. You can use India ink, but I've just found that the sheen of Sumi when it dries is much prettier than India ink. They're both equally easy to write with, but when the Sumi dries, it's just so pretty. So if you can get your hands on it, it's definitely a worthwhile investment. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again in other TPK videos.